Mosaic, a daily news program from Worldlink TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Welcome to the News of the Hour from Abu Dhabi Television. Representatives from the Quartet Committee present the Palestinian Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen with the roadmap to establish an independent Palestinian state. Now to our correspondent in Ramallah, Majid Saeed.
The roadmap has been placed on the Palestinian-Israeli negotiating table. Now international efforts are facing challenges due to Israeli demands, which may ruin the efforts of several countries who drafted the roadmap plan.
3 are dead and 55 injured during a martyrdom attack by the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. The attack occurred at a restaurant in close proximity to the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. 2 Palestinians were killed by Israeli gunfire when they tried to enter the El Mouris settlement near Nablus. A 3rd Palestinian was also martyred in Rafah, south of the Gaza Strip. The U.S. Secretary of Defense lands in Baghdad, arriving from Al-Basra. He stated that the Iraqis have been liberated from a brutal regime. 3 Iraqis have been killed and 6 others were wounded when the U.S. forces opened fire at demonstrators in Fallujah for the 2nd consecutive day. In a message published by the Arab Jerusalem, Saddam Hussein encourages Iraqis to resist the U.S. forces, saying that Baghdad fell due to deceit and treachery. The new Lebanese government, under the leadership of Rafiq al-Hariri, gains the confidence of parliament, receiving 85 votes versus 14 opposing votes and 12 abstentions.
The Palestinian Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen received the roadmap today in an effort to resume the peace talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon had received a copy of the roadmap earlier. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority demanded that Israel implement the roadmap and withdraw its forces from the occupied territories. U.S. President George Bush urged both sides to continue on the path of peace. However, the Palestinian factions who are opposed to the peace negotiations rejected the roadmap. Now to a report by our correspondent, Majid Saeed.
There was only an hour or two of difference between the delivery of the roadmap to Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and his Palestinian counterpart Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen. The Palestinians, who have long awaited this plan, rejected the Israeli demands of disarming the Intifada. It is an Israeli precondition to move forward with the roadmap as presented without any changes. They can't discuss preconditions or sequences because the requirements are parallel. Therefore, if the Israelis fulfill their duties, then without a doubt we will fulfill ours. Palestinian optimism was met with the European Union's support of this plan, but ultimately, if the plan is still missing the means to enforce it, the roadmap will face the same doomed fate of other plans.
The Quartet, the international community, come to the conclusion.
The international community came to the conclusion that to keep up the hope and success, we need to work on competent security measures. This is what is contained in the roadmap. Nevertheless, the assurances made by the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations were contradicted in a statement made by the U.S. representative, saying that this international initiative is not binding.
What we need to do now
is to focus on bringing both sides back to the negotiating table with a 2-state solution, Israel and Palestine coexisting. The roadmap is a guideline and not a treaty. The implementation of the roadmap was linked to a new Palestinian government. The roadmap was delivered to Abu Mazen after he and his ministers were sworn in front of President Arafat and in the presence of representatives from the Quartet Committee. Now the Palestinians officially received the roadmap plan, but this is only a preliminary step until active steps are taken to implement the plan. However, it is expected that Israel will hinder these efforts. Majid Saeed, Abu Dhabi Television, Ramallah.
People are wondering if Arafat's political career is over. Does the appointment of Abu Mazen mean that Arafat is out of the political game? This may actually happen with combined efforts from Israel and the United States, and with the blessing of European and Arab countries. How can we expect new peace negotiations without Arafat, who brought Oslo Agreement, though it did have some disadvantages? Does the sudden attention that the United States has paid to the peace process mean that it has a vision for what's coming next? Or is it just another attempt to calm down the region after the war in Iraq? Arafat used to be a regular visitor to the White House when former President Bill Clinton was in it, but now he's an undesired official in the eyes of Bush's administration. Arafat appeared to be paying the price for the failure of Camp David and his political role in Oslo Peace Agreement, which was stopped when Ariel Sharon became Israel's prime minister. Those who follow what's happening to the Palestinians realize that when Bush administration looks at the Middle East map, it only sees the Gulf. This was confirmed by the American war in Iraq. The American administration lack a clear political strategy for the peace process. Its efforts are only focused on fighting what is called terrorism. In the eyes of the American administration, that means ending the Palestinian Intifada and stripping Arafat from political legitimacy by linking him to the so-called terrorism.
We share a vision of
the two-state solution, Israeli and Palestinian states living side by side. This vision will not be achieved by terrorism, but through political negotiations. The Palestinian leadership must immediately stop all terrorist operations. After completing the war campaign in Iraq, the road is now open for Washington to eliminate Arafat politically. Arafat, the man we used to see going from one airplane to the other, is now under strict curfew. Not too many people call him, and the ones that visit him keep reminding him of the Israeli and American warnings if he does not change his policies. This finally have forced him to accept the appointment of his long-term friend Abu Mazen as a prime minister. There is no doubt that the American Secretary of State, Colin Powell, will appear as if he has achieved what the Americans and the Israelis wanted. The Americans have been successful in weakening Arafat and shrinking his political role in order to make the Palestinian leadership subservient to the American administration. The Palestinian political system will be reformed by introducing new generation that will be able to adapt to the new regional and international realities. Washington also pressured the European countries that participated in drawing the roadmap and some prominent Arab countries, including Egypt, to cut their ties with Arafat. The United States justified that by saying that the continued contacts with Arafat will weaken Abu Mazen and hurt his position. Arafat is an elected president, and he is the president of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He is the elected president of the Palestinian Authority. Arafat is the one that appointed Abu Mazen as prime minister, who is subjected to the National Palestinian Committees, just like everybody. In what may be considered as the first direct American mediation in the peace negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis for a long time, Colin Powell says that there is a need to establish a new government to create suitable atmosphere for the resumption of the peace process. The United States' motivation may be the desire to salvage its destroyed image in the Arab world, rather than the belief in the importance of resuming peace negotiations.
3 people were killed and 6 others severely injured after U.S. forces opened fire on Iraqi civilians, the second incident in 2 days. This occurred after last night's confrontation that killed 27 Iraqis and wounded tens of others, after U.S. forces fired at Iraqi students demonstrating at a school protesting the U.S. presence in Iraq. From Fallujah, a report by Hani Omra.
Another day in the city of Fallujah, where the center has been transformed into a U.S. base and the residents can hardly believe what is happening to them. At their demonstration, the crowd demanded that the Americans leave. More violent incidents have affected the Americans. The demonstration resulted in death, injuries, and blood everywhere. The demonstration was peaceful, 100%. They came from that school on the street to the U.S. Information and Military Headquarters over there, the Cultural Club, which was turned into another military center. Some of the members of the military that put down the demonstration first fired warning shots. Then they fired randomly into the crowd. They are surprised to learn of this intensity, since they only demanded that the Americans leave this quiet area, especially because Iraqis do not see the justification of the intense presence, which caused so much bloodshed in the past 2 days. In the city of Fallujah and surrounding areas, there are no laboratories or factories that can produce any kind of weapons or chemical weapons that they are talking about. There are no military labs in or around these borders. So what brings them here? What is the justification to rule the people? What is the justification that martyred 20 people?
Where is the entire world? Is this right, my son? Is this right? Is it right? They destroyed us from above with planes, and they don't let us sleep. We are sick and hungry. They break into homes and kill the women. They kill the children.
Although foreign correspondents in the area confirmed the incident from Iraqi eyewitnesses, a U.S. official still says that the gunfire came from the Iraqis and not from his American colleagues warning the Iraqis. However, the American account in response says the same thing every time.
We have not started.
We were not the first ones to fire. I said this before. We did not start firing. Someone from the crowd fired on us. They took a weapon and fired at one of our soft-skinned vehicles, shot it and hit it.
Fired at one of the soft-skinned vehicles, shot it and hit it.
Anxiety remains in this place, the focal point where another American military envoy will arrive to strengthen its position. Americans began to protect themselves by aggressively responding to citizens with force, especially in the face of expressions of threats and retaliation. I swear I will go to the people with force. I will wear explosives and bomb them myself. This is the blood of the martyr. This is the blood of the martyr that fell. God willing, we will retaliate for his sake. We will not allow them to enjoy this day after committing such a crime. The incident exceeds the geographical boundaries of this area, expanding into a national problem, leading many to believe that it will lead to further tension in Iraq. Hani Omer, Abu Dhabi TV, the city of Fallujah, west of Baghdad.
The European Union hailed the appointment of a new Palestinian government and said that the time is for the publication of a long-awaited plan to create a Palestinian state by the year 2005. For his part, Russia's Middle East envoy, Andrei Vidovin, said the approval of the Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas and his cabinet gives a real chance to stop violence and peacefully resolve the conflict in the region. Israel's military intelligence has warned that Palestinian Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas may not be able to deliver on his pledge to curb so-called violence, and that Yasser Arafat would remain the boss behind the scenes. The Israeli daily Haaretz quoted military sources as saying Mahmoud Abbas may have opposed the Intifada from the first day, but is barely a third of the new political framework in the Palestinian Authority. The other two-thirds are Yasser Arafat and the resistance organizations which continue to support what so-called violence. The Israeli Histadrut Trade Union Confederation said some 700,000 Israeli public sector workers launched an all-out strike Wednesday, forcing the closure of Israel's main international airport, as well as ports, train schools, the stock exchange, and government ministries. The strike was called in a protest at a draconian austerity plan due to be submitted to parliament later Wednesday by right-wing Israeli Finance Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, abrogating the collective agreements that have long governed Israel's public sector. The costs of facing down the 31-month-old Intifada, Palestinian Intifada, and the ravages of the global slump on Israel's key high-tech sector have sparked the worst recession in the 55-year history of the establishing of Israel on the land of Palestinians. U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell will travel this week to Europe, Syria, and Lebanon, but has deferred plans for a sweeping Middle East tour. The U.S. State Department said Powell will arrive in Spain Thursday before going on to Albania, Syria, and Lebanon, and return on Saturday. Testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on a host of issues, Powell said he expects to hold full discussions with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. He said he would evoke the issue of Syria's support of resistance groups, the claims about weapons of mass destruction, and the Syrian presence in Lebanon.
I hope that President Bashar al-Assad and his colleagues are looking at what's happening in the region and factoring that into their policy-making apparatus. A complete change in circumstances as a result of the end of the Saddam Hussein regime. So they have a different neighbor on their doorstep now. A neighbor that is going to be moving in a democratic way, and hopefully they've factored that in. What do we do about it?
Tension remains high in the Iraqi town of Fallujah after U.S. troops again opened fire on an anti-U.S. demonstration, killing 3 Iraqis and wounding more than 8. More than 7,000 were reported to have taken part in the demonstration against the U.S. presence in the country in the wake of the killings Monday evening that left more than 14 civilians dead, including children, in the same town located some 50 kilometers west of Baghdad. The U.S. forces also only admitted to have injured some protesters, claiming they were fired upon Monday by armed civilians mixed with a crowd of 200 protesters. And reports said today's protest was led by the Muslim Brotherhood in its first appearance after the collapse of the Iraqi regime. A witness, Safa Rusli, said the demonstration was peaceful and that U.S. soldiers riding in jeeps and armored vehicles mounted with guns opened fire after children in the crowd started pelting them with shoes and stones. A group of Iraqis will file a war crimes case in Brussels on May 13th against U.S. General Tommy Franks, the commander of American-led forces in Iraq. The group's Belgian lawyer, Jan Furman, said that the war crimes claim would specifically name Franks as well as unspecified U.S. troops who committed various war crimes across Iraq. Evidence in the claim, including video footage and interviews, were gathered by 2 Belgian doctors who were stationed in Baghdad during the war and just returned to Brussels last week. Atrocities in the case include U.S. bombing of a crowded market in northwest of the capital, which killed more than 60 people, as well as other actions. On Monday, U.S. State Department spokesman Richard Batcher said in Washington that the Bush administration was concerned over the new case.
These 19 Iraqis have been victims of different types of incidents, all of them very serious violations of the Geneva Conventions that protect civilians in war situation. Some of them are about shooting civilians, shooting at medical personnel. 3 incidents are related to ambulances that have been shot at by American troops. Some of the victims were hit by cluster bombs, which were dropped on civilian areas. So each and every of these incidents, events are to be considered as a violation of international humanitarian law.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld arrived in Baghdad Wednesday in the first tour of Iraq by a top U.S. official since the collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime. Rumsfeld spent the morning in the southern city of Basra, where he thanked U.S. and British troops for toppling the Iraqi regime and declared Iraq is free from a, quote, truly brutal, vicious regime. The last time Rumsfeld visited Baghdad was in December 1983 for a secret meeting with Saddam on a mission that led to closer relations between the United States and Iraq during its 1980-88 war against Iran. But since joining the cabinet of U.S. President George W. Bush, Rumsfeld became one of Washington's most powerful hawks, driving the campaign to invade Iraq and establish a pro-U.S. government in Baghdad. During this tour, Rumsfeld has repeatedly dismissed media reports that the U.S. plans to establish long-term military bases in Iraq, insisting that its troops would stay in the country only as long as they are needed. He is on a regional tour that has already taken him to Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. An Arabic newspaper splashed front page Wednesday what it said was a handwritten letter signed by Saddam Hussein urging the Iraqi people to rise up against U.S. troops who invaded and ousted his regime. Abdul Bari Atwan, editor of the London-based Al-Quds Al-Arabi, said the message to the Iraqi people was dated April 28th, the 66th birthday of the former strongman, whose whereabouts are still unknown. The daily quoted sources close to Saddam confirming that it was his own handwriting and signature. The message says that the U.S.-British military victory was only possible because of betrayal and calls on Iraqis who reject occupation and shame to rise up against occupation. The letter also urges Iraqis to set aside their differences, warning that U.S.-installed leaders will not bring them freedom. The former governor of southern Iraq's Basra province, Wahid Hamid Tawfiq al-Tikriti, turned himself in and is in custody, according to the Iraqi National Congress. He handed himself in to the INC in Baghdad, according to Haidar al-Musawi, a London-based spokesman for the group. The United States has decided to end 13 years of military presence in Saudi Arabia. The pullout was announced Tuesday by U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld at the end of a brief visit to the kingdom, where he and Saudi Defense Minister Sultan bin Abdulaziz said that the decision was taken by mutual agreement. But analysts saw the decision as the outcome of deteriorating relations between the two countries, as well as the new geopolitical situation in the Middle East.
The United States announced on Tuesday it will move the bulk of its troops stationed in Saudi Arabia to Qatar in what is said to be the first major step toward post-Iraq war reorganization of American military forces in the Gulf. It also ends a contentious 12 years U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia. Most of the 5,000 U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia will be gone within a period of 4 months. U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and officials traveling with him said in Riyadh that the U.S. military will remain in Saudi Arabia, but with a much smaller force focused primarily on training the Saudi military. At a joint news conference with Rumsfeld on Tuesday, Saudi Defense Minister Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz said military cooperation between the two countries would continue. He also said the U.S. withdrawal from the airbase named after him did not indicate a request request from the Saudis to leave. Both men put the withdrawal down to the end of Operation Southern Watch, where coalition pilots policed southern Iraq's no-fly zone and emphasized continuing goodwill between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. However, analysts said Washington's decision to move the bulk of its troops to Qatar was a natural result of currents in the Gulf region, including Arab frustration over the Iraq war and Muslims' fury at the presence of U.S. soldiers on their holy land. Ahmed Al-Ghamidi, a Saudi political analyst, said moving the troops from the kingdom would relieve the pressure off the government. Saudi officials, he added, know very well that the powerful religious establishment within the country was against this U.S. presence. Some other analysts see a growing mistrust between Saudis and Americans after the September 11 events, despite official denials. On Monday, Rumsfeld said that the Bush administration had a good and close relationship with the Saudi government. He also said, however, that the United States did not want to base its forces in countries where they were not welcome. Saudi unease about the presence of U.S. troops in their country is shown by their attempts to stifle news that American commanders were running the latest Iraqi air war from the Prince Sultan base. U.S. officials at the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia said the base would be left in condition to be available on short notice, and that only about 400 U.S. troops will remain in the kingdom, most of them near Riyadh, to train Saudi forces. The U.S. Air Operations Center has been already switched to Al Udeid base in Qatar.
Some 13 trucks carrying more than 500 tons of relief supplies to the Iraqi people have crossed the borders heading to Baghdad. The aid shipment, provided by the Jordan Hashemite charity organization, the Ministry of Health, and other international organizations, includes medical and food supplies. Health Minister Walid Maani said a Jordanian medical team will travel to Iraq on Saturday to carry out a vaccination campaign for about 10,000 Iraqi children. He said Jordan also started to receive some Iraqis wounded in the war for treatment, and an Iraqi man was admitted to Jordan University Hospital yesterday.
Meanwhile, life has moved on in the eastern city of Najaf from the days when American and Iraqi forces battled it out. But the fighting has left a painful legacy for many of the city's 200,000 residents. Parts of the town are littered with cluster bombs, which continue to claim lives after the toppling of Saddam Hussein. Human rights groups have called for a ban on cluster bombs because they disperse in civilian areas and are indiscriminate. Some explode and others land intact and primed. At the same time, thousands of Shiite Muslims have descended on the holy town of Najaf to commemorate the death of Prophet Muhammad. Iraqis, meanwhile, arrived at the United States Civil Affairs compound in Baghdad to be screened for potential jobs. It is the fourth day in 2 weeks the soldiers have held screenings, and they said they've been overwhelmed by the number of applicants. The army advertised the positions, leaflets, and radio broadcasts. Translators and doctors have already been employed, but the U.S. Army in Baghdad say they need many more people. Police officers are being processed through the police academy in a separate employment process that is likely to take weeks to complete. But 3 weeks after Saddam Hussein's overthrow, with no law and no government, the people of Baghdad feel alone, afraid, and angry more than ever before.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation,